Okay, everyone, welcome to Career Series So You Want to Be a Grief Counselor. This series will touch upon opportunities in a variety of career fields and what it takes to get into the business. My name is Cecilia. I am one of the librarians at the Ocean County Library. This will be a 45-minute program with a 15-minute Q&A with the presenter. If you have any tech issues, feel free to send me a private chat message. You can do that by clicking on my name, spelled Cecilia-Librarian. The same thing you can do for any Q&A questions as well. It's my pleasure to welcome Kailey Bradley. Kailey earned her Bachelor's of Arts from Mount Vernon Nazarene University in 2012 and finished her master's in clinical mental health counseling at Ashland Theological Seminary in 2015. Kailey has a background in hospice work and feels that advocating for grievers is her life's passion. Kailey believes that grief is not a problem to be solved or a diagnosis to fix. Her goal through her training groups and individual counseling sessions is to create a refuge where the normal plethora of emotions of grief are normalized and accepted as valid. Kailey specializes in working with individuals of all ages with special interest and care given to children's bereavement, complicated grief, prenatal loss, and chronic illness. Kailey has completed training at the Center for Loss and Life Transition and is a licensed clinical thanatologist. Kailey is also an adjacent professor at Ashland Theological Seminary, where she teaches grief and crisis counseling courses. Thank you for joining us today, Kailey.
Hi, I just muted myself because my dog was going a little crazy, so I figured no one wanted to hear my wild dog running around. But thank you so much for having me, and I'm excited to share a little bit about my background and just the different aspects of kind of my journey to becoming a grief counselor. So excited to be with you guys here for a little bit this evening.
Yeah, I'll turn things over to you.
Great. And I love questions, so please feel free to jump in with any questions. I know, and even too, I'll give you guys my email address at the end because I know if anyone's like me, there's always, I have 50 bazillion questions like after a presentation or after a meeting, so I totally get that too. So yeah, a little bit about me. My journey into becoming a counselor was kind of a long, winding road. I didn't think that counseling was going to be the profession that was for me. I actually started my academic career at the College of Worcester in Worcester, Ohio, as an archaeology major, interestingly, because I always had a fascination with other cultures, and in particular, how other cultures kind of handled loss. So I really envisioned that I would be an archaeologist kind of studying death rituals and in some remote geographical location, but kind of through my own life circumstances, where I needed counseling myself, got very interested in the mental health field. So that led me to Ashland University, where I got my master's in clinical mental health counseling in 2015. Even when I was in that program, though, I did not think that grief would be something that I would specialize in, but I began to slowly develop kind of an interest in how can I be somebody that supports people grieving. And the reason for that, my first counseling job, I actually worked at a locked residential treatment center for teenagers as a clinical counselor there. And I quickly kind of kept, bumping up against grief. My kids that had severe behavioral issues would often come into my office and share a lot about a wide range of losses that they had experienced, whether that was, being in a situation where they were in a foster home, whether they had lost a friend. I had a couple of people who had lost a parent. So I quickly realized that I was very ill prepared to sufficiently, I would say, support individuals in grief. So as part of my own journey, I decided that I needed to do a little more exploration and a little more training. And so I began to do some volunteer work at Hospice of Knox County in Mount Vernon, Ohio, which is my hometown. The primary area that I focused in at Hospice of Knox County was helping with something called Camp Hope, which was a children and teen bereavement camp. I quickly fell in love with helping kids and teenagers process grief and loss. And so when a position opened up at Hospice of North Central Ohio, which was kind of the larger hospice entity that was this, I should say, a sister hospice to Hospice of Knox County, I quickly jumped at the chance to become the bereavement coordinator for Hospice of North Central Ohio. I worked there for about 4.5 years. And through that 4.5 years, not only did I grow more and more interested in grief care, but also becoming more adept at being an end-of-life professional and how to navigate that and how to help families make end-of-life decisions and how to support families through those very complicated conversations. So I'll share a little bit tonight, not only about, how to become a grief professional or, a grief counselor, but also if you have an interest in end-of-life care in any capacity. So I just wanted to kind of point that out too. Through my 4.5 years at hospice as their bereavement coordinator, I did a lot of trainings with Dr. Alan Wolfelt, who has the Center for Loss and Life Transition in Fort Collins, Colorado. And then I also became a clinical thanatologist through the Association of Death Education and Counseling. Thanatology is simply the study of death and dying. So those are a little bit about my academic backgrounds. Some of my future goals, definitely, I have a goal to be eventually a certified death midwife, and I'll explain what that is here in a little bit. As I really, really have found, I love helping individuals transition as they leave this world. I also am an adjunct professor of grief counseling and crisis counseling at Ashland University and an adjunct professor of death and dying at North Central State College. So that's a little bit about me, my academic background. So let me keep going here. Again, what is a thanatologist? So this, maybe it'll let me click on it, maybe not. That's okay. I will maybe see if we can get anybody that came tonight some of these slides, because I kind of have peppered it with some resources. So I want to make sure that if you would like those, that you have access to those. So a thanatologist, as I said, is somebody who studies death and dying. And so ADEC is the Association of Death Educators and Counselors. And they have a really robust certification program for individuals who are interested in death and dying. It's one of the only certification credentialing bodies in the field of thanatology, so that's pretty cool. If you're interested, check out the ADEC website. It talks about all the educational requirements to receive that certification, and there are different kind of levels of certification. There's the certified thanatologist, and then there's the fellow in thanatologist. That's all on the website if that's intriguing to you, interesting to you. As a thanatologist, that really opens up some cool career opportunities for you. That in and of itself is oftentimes enough to work in a funeral home or a hospice agency as kind of a bereavement support person, okay? So it's a really cool certification if this area interests you. So again, my background, like I said, I worked for Hospice of North Central Ohio. And I would definitely recommend, if anybody's interested in becoming end-of-life professional, a grief counselor, whatever, in whatever capacity you're kind of intrigued by, volunteering at a local hospice agency is a great avenue to get your feet wet, to kind of develop a understanding of the hospice philosophy. So it's definitely, I think, the way that I got my feet wet. I volunteered and truly fell in love with the camp. And as I said, my interest in grief truly came from working at a locked residential facility, okay, where I kept bumping up against kids with grief and loss, and I just did not have the tools as a counselor to really adequately help. So what is a death doula? I mentioned that this is an area of interest of mine. So I am not yet a certified death doula. This is kind of in my column of future dreams and goals, but I did want you guys to get a wide range of maybe potential career opportunities in this field. So a death doula is similar to a birth doula. So when you think about the doula and the midwife movement and the birthing field, it is somebody who helps a mother and their baby enter this world, okay? So they're preparing for the birth. They are setting up the space. They're surrounding the mother with things that are comforting and relaxing to her, whether that's a certain type of music or a certain scent, okay? So a death doula, the death doula midwife movement, which is a fairly new movement, this is similar, except it's at the other end of the spectrum. And what I mean by that is that death doulas are individuals who help people as they're leaving this world. So they are going to support the family through that. They are going to maybe help a person plan for their end of life. So having conversations about what would you like to see at your end of life? Is there a certain place that you've always wished that you could visit? Well, you may not be able to visit, but can we incorporate virtual reality to make that happen? That was something our hospice agency did that was really interesting. We had a chaplain who was able to utilize virtual reality technology and VR goggles to help people kind of complete a bucket list at their end of life. A death doula is really attending to the whole person. So spiritual, emotional, physical. So all of those needs that might crop up at end of life, okay? So the death doula movement is, like I said, a fairly new movement, but it's becoming more and more popular. It's an extra support person for families at end of life that often works in conjunction with medical professionals, can work in conjunction with individuals who are on hospice care. And if anybody has specific questions about hospice, I'd be happy to answer some of those too. But again, I wanted to kind of give people tonight a wide range of career opportunities that may exist in the end of life field. So my website is allrefuge.com. And again, I wish I could show you guys this, but it's just not letting me click on links, but that's okay. So where I am today, this kind of leads us to the present time, is like I said, I'm a licensed professional clinical counselor, and I'll talk a little bit about that process of becoming a licensed professional clinical counselor. And I actually, with my husband, own and operate a small private practice where we focus, our tagline is, we focus on hard conversations. So all of our clinicians that work with us at Refuge Counseling, that's the name of our private practice, specialize in areas that don't often get attended to. So I specialize at grief, loss, chronic illness, and spiritual trauma. My husband is a sex therapist, or I should say he's practicing sex therapy and is in the process of becoming a sex therapist. He's in a pretty robust training program for that. So our small private practice has been very busy. But we truly try to create a safe haven for difficult conversations that even in the counseling space sometimes don't get talked about. So the other thing that I wanted to spend quite a bit of time tonight on, and I'm realizing I'm talking very fast, so I may get through this a lot quicker than I had hoped, but that's okay. I know some of you here might just be interested in the counseling field in general, so I wanted to spend some time kind of talking a little bit about that. So every state does have different licensing and credentialing requirements to be a licensed therapist. So I'm going to share a little bit about the process that I went through, but wherever you're watching this, definitely attend to what your state regulations are to become a therapist, because every state is a little bit different. But I am located in Ohio. and was licensed as a counselor in the state of Ohio. In the state of Ohio, there are a couple steps that you have to go through to become a licensed therapist. The first being you do have to complete a master's level program in clinical mental health counseling. Typically, that's a 2.5 to 3 year program, depending on where you choose to attend. As part of that program, you're given a wide range of content, lots of different classes. But the main part of that program is also practical, meaning you have to do both practicum and internship experiences. So you're getting hands-on work as a counselor under the supervision of a licensed counselor. And so once you complete your master's level program and you have completed your internship hours, you're then eligible to sit for your licensing exam. If you pass your licensing exam, again, this is in the state of Ohio, you become what's called a licensed professional counselor. Some states, it's called something a tiny bit different or slightly different. In Ohio, it's called a licensed professional counselor. The credentials for that are LPC. And so at that point, you are a therapist and can practice. Now, in the state of Ohio for 2 years or until you have 3,000 hours of experience as a counselor, you have to continue to be under supervision. And so a counseling supervisor supervises your work until you're eligible to become what's called a licensed independent clinical counselor. So an LPCC. At that point, you can then practice independently and are not under the supervision of a supervisor. So I know it's a little bit confusing, but it's kind of a two-step process as to become an independently licensed counselor in the state of Ohio. At that point, if you want to go a little bit further, you can become a supervisor. And so you have what's called a supervision credential. And so then you can supervise counseling interns or LPCs. So that's kind of a cool full circle moment when you're able to provide supervision that you were once, a student of. So kind of a full circle moment in becoming a clinical counselor. So that was a very long-winded explanation on the process of becoming a licensed professional counselor. If anybody has specific questions on that, happy to answer those questions as well. So some people often ask me, why study death? Isn't that depressing? Like, why is that interesting to you? I would say that, and I don't mean this to be unempathetic, but we do have 100% mortality rate. We will eventually die. And yet I think as a culture, we're often very hesitant to talk about it. And I get it. It's not an easy conversation. But I do think it's a vastly important one for a myriad of reasons that I don't have time to go into tonight. But suffice it to say, it's an important conversation. In recent years, we have seen an increase in what's called the death positive movement. So the death positive movement is kind of advocating for, let's talk about this. Let's talk about conversations surrounding death and dying and how to be prepared for it so that we die in the ways that maybe feel most comfortable to us as people. Okay. Many individuals will say that they would prefer to die at home, but the majority of us do end up dying in some sort of institution, whether that's a hospital or a nursing facility. Okay. And so having conversations can hopefully help prepare all of us to be able, like I said, to die in the ways that we might choose. I would say too, before I go on, if you're interested in the death positive movement, you can simply Google that and some phenomenal resources will pop up. Caitlin Doty is a great example of that. She is a mortician, and she has some great YouTube videos called Ask a Mortician. She has some great books as well. She's kind of considered one of the founders of the death positive movement. And it's pretty cool cool stuff, and her perspective, I think, was very valuable. So definitely, if you're interested in this, I would definitely suggest Googling it. Just explore it a little bit and observe maybe what feelings it's bringing up in you. I think in order to do this work, it's important to kind of be aware of our own feelings on these topics and evaluate that a little bit. So that's a question I get a lot. Why do you study this? Why do you find that interesting? It's kind of morbid. But honestly, in the work that I've done in my career so far, I truly have found it to be enriching and rewarding, especially when I'm able to have conversations with families, when they're sharing, pictures of their loved ones and able to talk with me about, what they want for their, funeral or what they want for their future. So, and I do apologize. It's very loud downstairs in my basement. I have a husband who is leading some sort of RPG game downstairs. So I apologize for that. So some other things about me that are a little bit unrelated, I guess, to my profession, although somewhat interconnected maybe. So my husband, Stephen, and I have been married for about 5.5 years now. We own our practice, Refuge Counseling, together. Like I mentioned, he's also a therapist, studying sex therapy. The picture below there is my dog Scout, who you guys already heard. She's a big, important part of my career, and I mean that because she is my self-care. And so I think when you work in this field, you do get drained, and I will be honest about that. And you are, I think, at risk for some compassion fatigue and burnout. And so it's so desperately important that you find ways to refill yourself. And Scout does that for me. So I also am a huge bookworm. I love to read all sorts of books. I read a lot of memoirs. I read a lot of young adult fiction. I try to read a wide range of books to keep me also, just kind of thinking about a lot of different things. I do a lot of work with grief and death and dying. And so sometimes I need books to kind of take me away from that for a little bit. So another favorite genre of mine, I love romance novels. I love just a book that takes you away for a little bit. So that's a little bit about me. I think that might be, I did have one more slide here. So in the future, I've already mentioned, I hope to become a certified death doula. I am entering a PhD program this fall in counseling education and supervision, just to kind of continue to develop my skills as a supervisor and as a teacher. I hope to continue to advocate for grief and death education across the lifespan. I hope someday to write a memoir on illness and living with chronic fatigue syndrome, which is something that I navigate. And then I hope to have a lot more dogs, because dogs just make everything better. So that's a little bit about all my future kind of goals. Just to kind of summarize, I know I've talked really, really fast, so we'll have plenty of time for some questions. But I hope that I gave you some different avenues to explore if end-of-life care is interesting to you. As I mentioned early on in the presentation, becoming a thanatologist through ADEC is a great avenue. If you're interested in maybe being a death educator, so teaching a little bit, working for a hospice agency. And then if you're interested in the particular counseling route, as I've kind of shared with you, kind of the complicated, or what feels complicated process to become a certified counselor. Again, if you have any questions on that, I'm happy to spend more time with that. The death doula movement, if that's of interest to you, that's another avenue to explore. All of these things are so very needed. One avenue that I didn't mention as a possible career is also a chaplain. So if you have an interest in spirituality, all hospice agencies have to have chaplains. And so the spiritual component of end-of-life care could be an area to explore that could be very valuable. I think as far as maybe being a high school student and exploring these topics, you know what? I think reading a lot of books, and I'm happy to provide a list as well. I can get that to you guys. Reading a lot of books on these topics, maybe interviewing local hospice workers. A whole other world that I didn't even mention tonight is the world of the funeral industry, so funeral workers. Okay, I got the chance this past spring to work with a lot of mortuary science students at North Central State College. So they were very specifically wanting to become funeral directors. So that's another area that I am not quite as familiar with because that's not my area of expertise, but I have worked with quite a few funeral directors and just think the world of funeral directors. So that's another area to explore. So I know I threw a lot at you guys with a lot of different options, you know, even beyond being just a grief counselor. There's a lot of wonderful resources out there too. Some great websites, already mentioned some phenomenal books on these topics. So I would encourage, if you're interested in this field at all, explore. And I think what you'll find is there's a real need for people who are willing to have these conversations. Most people don't want to kind of talk about death and dying, and I get it, like I already mentioned. But the support needed for families and individuals as they're going through these very human experiences is desperately missing in our culture. Especially, I've thought a lot about my career and what that has looked like just with COVID-19 and the collective grief and collective loss that we've been feeling as a culture. And so there is a need for people who have this interest. So I'm so glad that a couple of people, you know, were able to attend tonight, and hopefully more will be able to listen in. I think that's all I have. And I know I talked for much shorter than I was supposed to. I had a couple videos that we weren't able to show just because of the technology. But again, I am open to questions.
Okay, and feel free to send me any questions by clicking on my name and starting a private chat message.
Great.
I had some pre-made questions that I did to get the ball rolling.
Perfect.
Could you go into detail about what a typical day is like as a grief counselor?
Yeah, so I think every day is a little bit different. So for example, we'll just describe kind of my day today. So I had 2 counseling sessions with individuals this morning, both grief related. And then I actually spent the rest of my day in the afternoon teaching my crisis counseling class. And so it's usually, for me in particular, kind of a combination of client work and then also doing some teaching. I'm also, as I mentioned, or maybe I didn't mention, a counseling supervisor. So there's often work that I'm doing with my counseling interns. If they have questions, if they have thoughts or concerns that are coming up in the work they're doing, my job as the counseling supervisor is to kind of help companion and walk alongside them as they're developing as counselors themselves. So it's usually a combination of all of those things. Some days there's a different combination of that, but I'm usually doing one of those things. I will say my role when I was working at hospice was even more varied because we did a lot of memorial services. We did a lot of remembrance walks. So there was a lot of prepping for those kind of larger public events that we would do in our community. So there's, you know, it was a little bit different when I worked for hospice. But now, being a private practice counselor, it's usually a combination of teaching, supervising, and direct clinical work.
Okay, so we have one. I was wondering if you have interacted with many art therapists or how art might have played into your hospice work.
That's such a great question. I love that. Yeah, no, I think any expressive arts, whether that be art or dance or music, are so vastly helpful in processing grief and loss. So when we, as part of my role at hospice, we organized a children's bereavement camp, and we definitely utilized local art therapists and music therapists to help with some of the interventions that we did during camp, and our kids really gravitated towards that. I think especially with kids and teenagers, they might be more apt to share about their experience in that kind of a format versus just sitting across from me and talking to me. Play therapy is another big part of that, incorporating, various elements of gaming and play to process loss. Yeah, great question.
Do you have any book suggestions for those interested in learning more about grief counseling or dealing with death and grief?
Yes, I'm a huge book person. So, in fact, I even wrote out a list, and I meant to put it on a slide, and then I ran out of time. But let me pull that up for you guys. So, some great books on end-of-life care. The first one I always recommend is a book called Being Mortal. It's a great book written by a doctor, and it's kind of his perspective of how to have end-of-life conversations. There are some other ones called The Conversation, also about how to have end-of-life talks. Another one called Death Over Dinner, same kind of premise. I'll email these to you as well, and so that way you can, relay those if people want those. Another one that I always recommend on grief in particular is a book called It's Okay, You're Not Okay, by therapist Megan Devine. Her perspective on grief is very much that grief is not something to be fixed, it's something to be experienced, which has been very true in my own life and also what I see professionally as a grief counselor. I see a lot of people who just want to know that it's okay that they're feeling these things. And so a lot of what I do in my work is validating and saying, no, you're not crazy for feeling that. No, you're not abnormal for being upset. No, you're not weak for crying. All of those types of empathic statements that really do, I think, make a difference in processing our grief. So that's a phenomenal one. Let me see what else I can throw your guys' direction. There's another really great one called Understanding Your Grief by Dr. Alan Wolfelt. It is probably the first book that was given to me when I started down this path. My counseling supervisor, Dr. Sadler Gerhardt, when I shared with her, I really need some help in this area. A lot of my clients have grief and loss. I don't know even where to start. Understanding Your Grief by Dr. Alan Wolfelt was one that she recommended to me. I also have found that a lot of young adult books have some themes of grief and loss. So I have a whole other list of young adult books that I can compile too, that I think touch on some of these topics. There's even one, and the name is slipping my head, that's phenomenal, and it's actually about a grief camp. So it's super good, super good. So there's a lot of great resources out there. There's also some really good websites. My favorite website is called watchyourgrief.com. Super helpful, practical, lots of unique articles, lots of various topics covered on that website, even for different ages, different types of losses. I always recommend that website. And I like it because it's very approachable, relatable. It's not really written in, clinical language. It's really just for people who want some support and resources. So that's a really great resource. Another great website is called modernloss.com. That one I would say is a little more geared towards adults and not kids and teens, but Modern Loss is phenomenal. There's also a book by that same name, Modern Loss. Again, a wide range of topics. People can submit essays on that website, which is kind of cool. So there's just a wide range of different niches and phenomenal website as well. So yeah, hopefully that helps. There's so many more I could throw out, and I will definitely kind of compile a list and get it to people that are interested for sure. Yeah.
Anything you wanted to send to everyone? If anybody didn't register for today, because I threw up on the website, if you want to send me
That'd be awesome.
their email address, and we can
I
get
will do that.
these lists to you.
For sure, for sure.
So we have a question on, you mentioned spiritual trauma. They wanted a little bit more elaboration on what exactly that is.
Yeah, great question. So yeah, it's another area of specialization as a counselor. So, spiritual trauma is something that I've probably within the last 6 months gotten more interested in as a counselor. So this is a kind of a newer little path I'm exploring, but I have a lot of counseling clients currently who are really struggling with just spirituality that has shifted and changed maybe for them. And so creating space for them to explore what their spirituality looks like in a different context maybe. I've also had some clients who unfortunately maybe have had a lot of hurt and pain as a result of maybe where they're at spiritually, whether that's individuals that I've worked with who are members of the LGBTQIA community and who have been maybe told that they're not welcome in their particular faith community. That's probably the biggest example of spiritual trauma that my counseling agency works with. So we see that a lot. And so again, being able to support and validate their experiences and provide that compassionate presence. So yeah, really good question. Yeah. These are all good questions. I love it.
How was opening up your own practice? Can you talk a little bit about the...
Yeah, great question. Yeah, it's a learning experience, and I keep saying I feel like we're learning something new every day. We just opened our own private practice only back in March. So we've only been at this for like 2 months. So it's been a challenge, but a good challenge. So it can be a complicated process. Different counselors kind of do it in different ways. But we have had a really good team of people helping us with things like insurance. How do you get on insurance panels so you can, people can use their insurance to access counseling. So some of those logistical things we definitely ask for help with. And so I definitely always tell my students and my interns that asking for help is like the best thing you can do sometimes. So, but we've been very busy, which is exciting. There's always the, anxiety of, I'm opening this counseling practice. Am I going to have any clients? All of that. So we've fortunately, have stayed busy. I don't know if that's fortunately or unfortunately, because it means there's people hurting. So it's kind of one of those paradoxical things, but that's a great question. Yeah. And if anybody's interested in any of those logistical kind of dimensions that we kind of had to figure out, opening our own practice, we're happy to, my husband and I are happy to talk about that too. But it's been a fun journey so far. So still a lot to learn and, growing pains for sure, but it's all good.
What advice would you give someone starting off in this field?
I would give, it's funny, I'm not a huge advice person because I think everybody's life circumstances are so different and unique, but I would say read a lot, get in, read a lot of books on this topic, volunteer, or at least maybe start having dialogue with people either working in a hospice agency, even just begin to explore your local hospice and what that hospice has to offer. Different hospices are different. And so, even just getting familiar with the resources in your community for this area can be helpful. But I think for me, it really was some self-exploration. I always, like I mentioned, circling all the way back to the beginning of my lecture, I always had an interest in death rituals. That's why I wanted to be an archaeologist. So that interest was always there. It's just been a winding road where that interest ultimately took me was kind of in a mental health support perspective. So lots, and that's what I love about this field too. There's lots of different avenues to explore, you know. If you're interested in kind of the academic researchy part of thanatology, there's space for that too, you know. There's space to do the research component as well. But I would suggest, yeah, read. Maybe, you know, even if you're considering this field and you come across a movie with some of these themes, even self-reflection, you know, reflecting what is this bringing up in me? How do I feel about these topics? I think this field does lend itself to quite a bit of self-reflection. So those would be my two things, some self-reflection and read. Yeah.
What has been the most rewarding aspect of your job?
There's a lot of rewarding aspects. I think just when people who I've worked with reiterate to me how good it felt for them to be heard, that I didn't make them feel, you know, weird or shamed for crying or for experiencing their grief. I often say that I'd be a very wealthy woman if I got paid every time somebody apologized to me for crying. But yeah, there's real beauty in and a dimension of you know, just sacredness that comes from being with people in this space. And I love it when people just say, yeah, I didn't feel judged. Thank you for that. That's probably the most rewarding thing.
What are some skills or attributes do you think someone starting off in this field should have?
Yeah, I think it's probably cliche, but obviously the necessity for empathy and compassion are big, you know. I think, and this has been a learning process for me, our natural instinct often when somebody is in pain or suffering is to want to fix that and to kind of swoop in and come up with a quick solution so that person is feeling better. So learning to kind of to sit with discomfort has been a learning process, but I think it's made me a better grief counselor to be able to step back and say, okay, it's not my role to take this person's grief away from them. I'm simply, as Dr. Wolfelt, my mentor would say, a companion. And that's really been an orienting and grounding piece of the work that I do. So yeah, I think also curiosity. I think that's a characteristic that I think makes a good grief counselor, being curious about what another person's experience is like, what is their perspective, and even from a multicultural perspective, you know, how does this culture approach death and dying? How is it similar to mine? How is it different than mine? And how might that manifest in how, you know, this client or family I'm working with expresses their grief? So yeah, an element of curiosity I think is important. As I already mentioned, I think being self-reflective is important. And then also, I know I've already said it, and maybe this isn't necessarily an attribute, but I would just say an important characteristic to have is also, though, not to take yourself too seriously. There is some humor in this work too. You know, sometimes people will share really funny stories with me about something that happened at their loved one's funeral, or something funny that their loved one used to do, or a characteristic about their loved one that was funny. So it isn't all heavy and serious all the time. And especially, you know, working with kids in grief, there's, again, a lot of play, a lot of expression, a lot of, you know, creativity. And so it's not all heavy all the time. And I do think having that sense of humor is really, I think, how you manage the heaviness of the work. So that was kind of a long-winded list there.
Okay. What is the hardest aspect of your job?
I think, and I'm slowly that's the key word, getting better at this, but sometimes just disentangling from the emotional impact of some of the stories you hear. We talk a lot about this in the counseling profession, boundaries and, being able to kind of disentangle and have a sense of differentiation between, your work and your private life. I'm not always great at this. This is a growing area for me, but I think that's probably the hardest to mention, is disentangling sometimes from the emotional heaviness. That's where my dog comes in, like I said.
More an educational question.
Yeah, totally.
What types of classes did you take? Did you have any favorite courses that you took while you were either an undergrad or doing your master's?
Yeah, I would say, oh man, that's a great question. In undergrad, definitely loved the anthropology classes that I took at the College of Worcester. They were so amazing. And then I would say in graduate school, probably shocking, my grief counseling class was my favorite. So I actually audited that class to not take it because I didn't need the elective. But again, I was starting to develop a little bit of this interest in grief. And so that was probably my favorite class in graduate school. And also my play therapy class in graduate school was probably my other favorite. So yeah, and a lot of classes that you will take in graduate school, if you go into the counseling field, prepare you to kind of be what's called a generalist as a counselor. So meaning you have a good sturdy foundation, and then later on you can kind of begin to explore some of these different areas of interest. But so yeah, I felt like I was very fortunate. I really enjoyed my graduate program. Felt like I got a wide range of really good content. But yeah, gotta love those anthropology classes. Oh man, I wish I could go back and take a lot of them actually.
Let's see. What did you learn about your career field that surprised you, that you didn't think was something?
Yeah, that's a good, man, these are good questions. Probably what surprised me was just the variety of avenues that you could go into with grief and death and dying. I think probably as a high schooler, I probably didn't even, well, I know I didn't know what hospice was. I just, that was not on my radar at all. So just maybe even just that in and of itself too, was surprised at, yeah, what I didn't know about hospice, what all hospice had to offer. Yeah, I would say that those two things kind of just more generally didn't realize all the avenues you could explore, and then also just realized that I didn't know a lot about hospice care. So yeah, definitely thankful that I had that experience.
Okay, we have time for a few more questions, so if anybody wants to send any in, let's see if. What is the best part of your day while working in this field?
The best part of my day is probably, these days I really like teaching, which is surprising. So I like teaching my grief classes and my crisis classes. So I would say lately the best part of my day is kind of putting my lectures together for my classes. I like kind of gathering resources and putting those pieces together. I've always said that I am not a person that can do the same thing every day from 8 to 5. So I do love that this field, it gives you some variety. You're not doing the same thing every day often. So
I actually just thought of one.
Yeah, totally.
Could you talk a little bit about death rituals? Do you have any particular ones you have either a favorite or most interesting that really
Yeah.
made you think?
Yeah, great question. So, yeah, I'm very interested in Jewish death rituals and the process of sitting Shiva. And I think I love it because rituals are so important because grief is sometimes so hard. Well, let me say this. Grief often transcends language and words. And so rituals sometimes creates a tangible representation of what we're experiencing, of what we're feeling. I often say when words don't quite cut it, that's where ritual can enter into. So I think what I love about the Jewish tradition of sitting Shiva is that, when families come for those 7 days to support the family who's lost a loved one, they're not supposed to say much. They're supposed to just sit with. And I think so often in grief where we get in trouble and offering support is when we say really stupid things, right? And we all do it. Like, even as a grief counselor, sometimes I'll be like, oh, why did I say it that way? So I love this idea of there are no magic words because nothing I say is going to take somebody's pain away. But I love that component of the Jewish tradition that but you know what? I can sit with you and I can be a presence to let you know you're not alone in this. So that's a beautiful component of Shiva. And I love that it gives permission. It's permission granting. There's all of these very detailed symbolic elements to it that, again, sometimes in our fast-paced culture that we live in can be kind of missed. So the Jewish tradition is something I'm very fascinated with. I'm also really interested in things kind of more contemporary death rituals such as green burial. And I don't even have time to probably go into all of that, but green burial is very interesting to me. I think in general, some of the rituals that the death duel movement incorporates, creating that sacred space for somebody and whatever that looks like for that person. So even something as simple as lighting a candle and reading a poem that reminds you of your loved one, that's a ritual. So I'm all about those death rituals for sure.
Okay, we have a couple people typing, so
Cool.
in the meantime, let me see if I can grab a quick question from my. I don't know if you answered this and complete, but how many years of schooling did you need in order to
You know what? I didn't really answer that. So no, it's a really good practical question. Yeah. So my undergraduate was standard 4 years. And then my master's program was 2.5 years. So some people complete the program in a little bit longer though. So 3 to 3.5 years. So typically a counseling master's program, you're looking at 2.5 to 3.5 years. So yeah, good question. I can't believe I didn't answer that.
And you are entering a PhD program in the fall.
Yes.
How long does that usually expected?
Yeah. So that's a good question. It's no, no. It's supposed to be like a 2 to 3 year academic content, and then another 2 years to complete the dissertation. But I know that can vary, and so I know some PhD students are probably laughing at me if I say only 2 years because it will likely be longer than that for my actual dissertation. So. I will share real quickly, what I'm hoping to do, and again, this may very much change, but I'm hoping to incorporate in my PhD dissertation death and grief education curriculum that I can provide to schools to incorporate in whether that's a health class, whether that's, a wellness class. Certain high schools have wellness classes, but I'd love to be able to provide comprehensive death and grief education curriculum for K through 12. So that's hopefully, some variant of that because death and grief education is also something I'm really passionate about.
Yeah, that's a that's a great thing to bring into the school system too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. That's my bias.
Actually answered one of the questions that just came in.
Cool.
Any ideas. So
Yeah.
let's see. This chat was so affirming. Can't wait to borrow all the books you mentioned. So.
Oh, yay.
If anyone wants to send me their email address, you can do so on the private chat. I'll leave the program open for a little while.
And then anybody feel free. I'm trying to think. Yeah. So here's my email. It's just Kailey@allrefuge.com. And so always happy to have more conversations with people. I always say my virtual door is always open. So shoot me an email.
Yes. Thank you so much for joining us today.
This was so fun.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much for the wonderful program and information.
Absolutely.
So this is a part of a series of programs. So our next one will be Wednesday, June 23rd at 6 p.m. And it will be So You Want to Be an LGBTQ Activist in honor of Pride Month. So thank you everyone for joining today. And I will send out an email with the book list and any other information that Kailey will provide to me. And I'll send her email address as well, as long as you're fine with that.
Totally fine with that. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And you'll also be getting the YouTube link to this once it goes up on our YouTube.
Oh, very cool.
Yes. So everybody will be getting that.
I've never been on YouTube before, guys.
Everybody have a great night.
Thanks.
Support public libraries. Like, share, and subscribe for more great videos.